Okay, good. Welcome, everyone. My name is Chaku Mathai, and I'm a person in recovery. I'm in upstate New York now, in Rochester, New York. Just recently moved back up from New York City in Washington Heights. So happy to have our gathering today. And, we have a short amount of time, so I want to get us started with some immediate thoughts. I'm currently the board president for New York, and, coming right after Joe as our past president of New York. And both of us, shared a vision for really having a recovery community that just did not see recovery happening without racial equity, without a vision for Black Lives Matter, without a recognition of the racialized trauma that we all experience together as a community. And that every time a person comes towards our movement, that we're having a trauma-informed understanding of not just what's happening individually for a person, but what's happening for a community, what's happening for our generation, what's happening for our movement historically, and our community historically. I know for myself as a young person coming into recovery that it was Black men who mentored me and sought me out and supported me in their understanding of what I was going through. They understood my racialized trauma. They understood that my experiences with racism and xenophobia and the exclusion and the loss of belonging and the generations of my indigenous community of my people were carried within my body, and that I needed to do something with that. And that until I did, I was just going to be carrying it towards others in a way that just kept perpetuating this. So I wonder sometimes, what have we done in our movement to address that? What do we know about how to heal from our racialized trauma together? Because it's not enough to do it individually anymore. It's never been enough, right? That's why we came together, because it wasn't enough to just find our recovery and go get a job and do well. We needed to do it for each other. The nation was bound up together, whether it's as individuals in recovery, whether it's as family members, whether it's as allies, whether it's as people in government, whether it's police. How do we do that? How do we seek each other's liberation in a way that is meaningful and honors the oppression and marginalization and the power and the privilege that we have? So that's a big set of things to ask from this incredible panel, but I'd love it if we started there. And I know each of them are going to go where they went. So let me get out of the way and kind of ask each of you to introduce yourselves for a few minutes. I'm going to start with Felicia Pullen. Felicia.
Hi, Chucko, and everyone who's out there listening to this really important conversation. I'm Felicia Pullen. I am a woman in recovery, and that is the first space of my intersectionality that I like to address because I never consider myself to be any different than anyone else that comes through the recovery center that I founded in Harlem. Um, Born and raised in Harlem, came back to Harlem to give back to Harlem, found myself in recovery, the mother that I could be, that I was not. And so I love the fact that Chaku really began talking about this systemically and talking about it in the context of the environment and the trauma that happens in an environment such as Harlem. And so I will I will embrace that framework as well and hope to bring some historical context to our conversation in terms of how our community, the Black community, has been marginalized historically from a drug enforcement policy perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Felicia. Joe.
And Chaco, I was moved by your words, and thank you for that. I know you, and I know your authenticity. But I'm glad to be with people I admire up close and far away. I mean, this panel, the people on here are dear to me. I'm Joe Turner, and I am the CEO of Exponents. If I started to check off the boxes of identity, let's just put it like this. I wouldn't pass a background check, okay? There's get another candidate. But, I come to this conversation, look at my age. I'm a Black man. To survive, just the onslaught. I'm from Brownsville, Brooklyn. To reach this age, it's almost like walking a tightrope of drugs and incarceration. I'm a Black harm reductionist, but I stand with Saida as an anti-racist. And that speaks to many things. One is that you cannot address recovery without addressing structural inequity. It makes no sense. These inequities that we're looking at, Felicia talked about police misconduct, that we look at inadequate healthcare, education, community trauma. All of these inequities, exacerbate even overdose deaths. They inhibit recovery. You cannot deal with this in a silo. You have to provide a holistic view of the world, and that includes dismantling, systemic structures that not only hurt us, they kill Black people. The overdose crisis I just heard on the news today, we're looking at over 100,000 overdose deaths. You look at, you hear that figure, but it disproportionately affects Black people. We die at higher proportions in our population. So we have to provide that overview of the issue. So I want to thank everybody. I want to thank the 136 people on this call. God bless you, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Joe. Tracy.
Hey, good morning. Tracy Gardner. I'm a woman in recovery as well. And that identity is very important to me and informs just about everything I do. I work with an organization called Legal Action Center, which is a law and policy organization, and we're the only one in the country that addresses criminal justice, HIV, and issues around drug use. And so, this conversation is one, quite frankly, that many of us have been having for at least 40 years. My organization got started shortly after the Rockefeller drug laws were implemented, which was part of the machinery of the racist war on drugs. And so everything that's happened in that respect has been racialized. And if we in the recovery community don't recognize that, then we will be part of perpetuating the continued two-tiered system. And, it has to be said that we've been talking about recovery for a long time. We've been talking about the ravages of drug use and bad drug policy and law enforcement in Black and Brown communities for a long time, but it took white people really experiencing the treatment system, in particular, the treatment and the health system that discriminated against us wantonly. It took the white community to discover that and to reject it. And so we're seeing changes happen in this space that are happening by leaps and bounds, whereas before it was simply a slow crawl. Many of us on this call have survived the HIV era. I certainly did not think that I would see, it's not the end of HIV, but certainly where we are now, given its ravages on Black and Brown communities. And I'll close with this. Joe mentioned the overdose numbers are, into the 100,000. And that's a particular period of time, right? Like it was happening before COVID hit and COVID exacerbated. I've been struck by the fact that the highest number of overdose deaths have been among Black people and Native Americans, which shows you that the implications of public policies to destroy non-white people, to destroy Black people and Native Americans reverberates today. And so, we have a lot of work ahead of us, and I'm glad to be a part of it.
Thank you, Tracy. Saida.
Good morning, community. I have to be honest, this is very early in the morning for me, so I hope that I say something that's worth listening to. Chaku, thank you for the opening. I like Joe, was really appreciative of your sharing your experience. I will say I identify first as an anti-racist. I will also then say thank you to being invited into this space. I am not a person who identifies as a person who's living in recovery due to substance use. And I think that that's important for me to say, because I believe I'm living in recovery for a lot of things. I'm living in recovery as a child who came out of a household where domestic violence lived, where alcohol misuse happened, and xenophobia, existed because they were immigrants, all of the things that I think that we're recovering from. And I think as we talk about this panel this morning and we talk about recovery, one of the things I would like to challenge us in is understanding what Black folks are all recovering from and not siloing our recovery any longer. And saying that a young person that's come out the foster care system who may have never used is not in dire need of recovery, and the same tenets that may be in this recovery system needs to be expanded out. And I just say that because a lot of the times, and I'm sorry, the heat is coming on in my house. A lot of the times, I think we forget that being Black in America might be the greatest thing that you'll try to recover from for the rest of your life. So ELMCOR has been around. I'm the CEO of ELMCOR, has been around for 56 years. A Black led, Black started, Black owned. And we say Black owned, even though it's a nonprofit, because the community is who owns this juncture of how we created ourselves. It's a lifespan organization. And so it started in '65 during the Black Power movement, during the Civil Rights movement, in a response to what was happening at the time, which was heroin and a lot of the other things of poverty and all the issues and the points of entry into a lot of folks using. And so ELMCOR started 56 years ago. There's very few programs that are around that started at that time, especially that started by Black folks. So we're in constant recovery. It's cyclical, the amount of lapse and relapse that we experience, a lot of the attacks that we are under, a lot of the being in spaces where whiteness is the gaze and the dominant culture of where we're trying to survive. So I just want to say thank you for being a part of this conversation with Black leadership, to have a conversation about Black Lives Matter and to really challenge our understanding of recovery and expanding it beyond what we believe it should be for today, but what we need to do moving forward in order to truly heal our community as a whole.
Thank you, Saida. So let's go there. We are certainly going to, move this towards the overall conversation about it being an anti-racist movement and what that looks like. But let's pull back for a moment, because each of you are here about, do Black Lives Matter? I mean, this is something very specific, a deep dive into the experience of Black people in our movement. And so let's speak to that. Who wants to begin that process?
So I will defer to
Tracy.
my elder.
Don't do it, Tracy. Go ahead.
No. I will defer to my elders. Kick it off, Joe.
Okay. I thank you, Chaku. Thank you, so gracious, Tracy. That in this recovery space, I think some would like it to be sort of an Alice in Wonderland where race and class and gender does not inform recovery, or the system. But I've seen it firsthand. We've all seen it firsthand. We talked about the inequity, especially even if you look in the treatment field. The data reveals that in residential treatment settings, Blacks are discharged discharged at a disproportionate rate. And they say that these are administrative discharges. And clinically, it's labeled that they're not amenable for treatment. You know, I mean, how stark is that? Yet they continue with these same treatment methodologies that did not encompass a recognition of race in this move forward. And I think this causes irreparable damage. The other thing, and so the answer is yes, Chaku, race does matter. So I just wanted to give that one example to set the stage of how it happens in the recovery field. The second example I'll give, and I'll be quiet after this, is that in the recovery movement itself, I remember years ago when For New York would have these, the rallies at the church, remember that? And it was all white, maybe one or two celebrity Blacks that would come up and, you know, sing a song or something like that. But, you know, it was nothing about us. It wasn't grounded in the reality of even people here in New York City. Did not represent the far majority of people that were dealing with recovery. So that movement in itself was identified as white. And especially in some of the prevention settings. I mean, Saida and Felicia, they have solid prevention programs, but they go, I mean, unrecognized, except for the people in the community who they're helping. You know, that has been hijacked, you know, by programs upstate and identified that do not address these issues. So I just wanted to lay that groundwork. So go ahead, Tracy.
I was particularly the being able to talk specifically about the Black experience in recovery and not have it be BIPOC or people of color, which is not to say there aren't other impacts among people who are not white, but talking about being Black and in recovery and the substance use disorder and drug use and the interlock of substance use disorder with the criminal legal system, all of that is influenced by the baked in anti-Black racism that is part of the founding of this country, part of, and so I just want to relate something that, kind of personal, but also like observational, that as a, when the last administration came into office, there was a big movement to create recovery spaces, 12-step spaces where people could talk about that because they no longer felt safe in their respective, particularly, in certain recovery spaces. The people did not feel safe. It was almost as though these people that we knew and who watched us come into recovery and struggle and then, be restored, we couldn't trust them because we knew that somebody voted for that administration, and it could be people, the very people we've been sharing our lives with on a daily basis, who helped us, save our lives in some ways. The hand of the 12-step meeting being primary. And then more recently with the George Floyd killing, there was even a more massive buildup where I saw people liberated to talk about the fact that they have felt shut down in predominantly white rooms of recovery when they tried to talk about race and were told it was an outside issue. And so you've got an existing generation of people who've grown up in 12-step, but then you had these young people coming in who were absolutely not going to allow that. And the freedom, I experienced it, the freedom to talk about things that have happened in my life in the way that Saida, talked about it. It's not that they made me use, but it cannot be separated from how I navigated through life and what, I'm going to say, for me, what then became necessary to self-soothe. And again, generational history, generational experiences of my family struggling with the treatment system, justice system. And so that is something I really, because that didn't happen in predominantly white 12-step rooms. The reckoning that George Floyd brought and the freedom, it's not that these issues weren't there, but the freedom to be able to talk about the fact that they were there. They're an essential part of talking of people's lives who are in recovery, trying to achieve recovery. And also that idea of what is recovery, like opening the spectrum of recovery is what you say it is. And harm reduction being understood as if you love someone, not if you love someone, you don't let them hit bottom. Not in this environment, that's consigning people to death. All of those tenets that many of us were raised with in 12-step, we are now seeing many of them are especially harmful to us as Black people. So I'm eager to hear about Felicia starting this recovery space. I was working in the governor's office when these started rolling out, and she is one, if not the only, in the state and talking about how that came about. Because you would think there would be more given the impact. So.
Wow. Tracy, you know, what you were saying just touched me from so many different perspectives. Being a woman in recovery that does find recovery in 12-step spaces, what you said just completely resonated for me. And the beauty, I think, out of this moment and the movement is that I did see a lot of BIPOC spaces popping up that were affirming and reaffirming some of the things that I was feeling and saying and thinking, and people who were showing me that it was okay to say them in spaces where I did not feel comfortable saying them before. And thank you for the recognition of what we, and I say we, were able to build in Harlem, because all I did was, you know, put the logo on the walls and then went out and told the people that it was there, and they were the ones that built the space. And I love when Saida said that, right? Black owned, because it is the Black community that is my boss, right? And that is something that I say all the time. I think for me, it was just really easy to conceptualize what recovery should look like and what privileged people were afforded, because I too was a privileged person who was afforded recovery because I had decent insurance, because I was married to someone who had decent insurance. And so when I went to treatment, I was exposed to yoga, meditation, acupuncture, sweat lodges, you know, walks on the beach, but I was privileged. And so I knew that when I came back to Harlem, I wanted to give back those same things that I received at no cost to the people who deserve to have them too. That community raised me. How dare I not go back to give back to it? A lot of my trauma was experienced in Harlem, and I knew that a lot of that trauma was still being experienced by others in Harlem, whether they were a generation before, within my generation, or those that were coming behind me. And so with that, I knew that it was not just the holistic approaches, and I love harm reduction, don't get me wrong, but that was not the vision when I first conceptualized this space. The space was, how do I offer these holistic approaches for people who may not want to or know how to embrace yoga and acupuncture, right? That was not something that was inherent in our community. It was go to church and pray it away. Don't talk about it if it happened in the house. And so how do I begin to offer something more than what some of the others in the community were already offering? But I also knew that there were some other things that I wanted to do. I wanted to talk about some of the environmental issues that were inherent in the community as well. the housing insecurity. And so we brought in a specialist that really would help people understand how to obtain a voucher, how to talk to FEPS, how to navigate the system. Parenting skills enhancement classes. I knew that everybody came to the table with parenting skills, but how did we just enhance what they had? So these were the little nuances that I thought were important as I was bringing my concept to the table, but then ask the community, well, what do you think? And if I designed it from the top and dropped it down into the community, it almost never worked. And so I needed their voices to tell me, yes, we need free medical appointments because we're uninsured and underinsured. And so I went out and found partners to do that. I don't do any of this alone. I am just so grateful that I have the ability to ask the people and then to go out and network and find those that can bring the muscle to the table that I don't have. And that was key for me, to know that I cannot do this by myself, that I needed the people to tell me what they wanted and needed. And then I had to go out and hit the ground and find the partners that would bring the services in that I didn't have the money to do. And so I don't want us to leave out of this conversation the financial commitment that we continue to need from the state and the federal government to do this work among Black people. And we don't have enough money to do it. And we need more funding and finances to talk about equity. We need more to bring equity to the table. And I don't want the word equity to be co-opted by, oh, equity of people in addiction to receive services on par with those that just have other chronic diseases. No, we need to reclaim what equity is and understand that we're talking about equity for Black people. And I don't want that to get lost in our conversations.
So I think that, Felicia, what you just said is really important, right? About the equity and about the financial equity that's required to reinvest and to invest in Black communities specifically. I think, Chaku, the question really was like, does Black lives matter? Is this really the conversation? And Tracy pointed out that, you know, we have to be specific about Black folks. And so for me as an anti-racist, I also have to say I'm not an anti-racist post Floyd, right? As many people have used this term in the last year and a half and are trying to, I'll use your word, Felicia, co-opt the concept. As an anti-racist, what I understand is that we're systemically dealing with a system that was created for Black people to be at the bottom. And I think it's very important that we say that. It is not a system that is set up for our brown brothers to be at the bottom. It's not said, it doesn't mean that they will not be oppressed. We're not in our oppression Olympics. We're not trying to say who's worse off than who. Our Indigenous brothers and sisters who were in this country originally were not designed to be at the bottom because they weren't designed to be here at all, right? And I think that that's something that people need to recognize when we have these conversations. So do Black lives matter? They've always mattered because we're required to be at the bottom for this system to work. And so it has always mattered that we've been here. The question is, how do we matter moving forward? Do we matter to continue to stay at the bottom of the system, or do we matter to have some equity, as Felicia said, and all the equity, and so that we're not continuously at the bottom? So when we talk about in recovery spaces, Black people not feeling safe to be able to say their experience or that it was white spaces, it was designed so. When we talk about it in treatment, it was designed so. And so there's something about us saying that as anti-racist, we recognize that this system was created to have Black people at the bottom, and that we have always been the people who mattered because we are the commodity that makes it work. It's the reason why we're disproportionately in prison systems. It is a business. It's the reason why we're disproportionately in the treatment systems, because it's a business. It's just the reason why we're disproportionately in the foster care system, because it is a business. And there is something in this country, and quite honestly, globally, if we really want to have a conversation about the fact that Black bodies have fed this system and this financial economic system in such a way that it is acceptable for us to be at the bottom. And so I challenge the concept of having any conversation of any kind about a system and saying that Black lives don't matter. We've always mattered. How do we matter moving forward is what matters to me.
Thank you, Saida, Tracy, Felicia, and Joe. We've started a very important beginning to that question of how do Black Lives Matter. Let me just kind of share a brief moment of my experience with this as an Indian in leadership, in recovery. Indian community was very excited that I was going to start talking about Indians in recovery and things like that. And one of the first disappointments that they experienced of me and in recovery was that I said, yeah, I'm not sure that matters as much as our focus on Black lives. And I was struck by how difficult it was for other racialized people, much less white people, to actually describe why it mattered to talk about Black lives in a different way, or even how to do it, or how to pursue the money, or how to even fundraise for it. Just every little turn was that difficult, because the immediate question was, well, don't I matter too? And it became, like you said, an oppression Olympics, and it wasn't about that. And so I'm still struggling around how to unify around that principle that, if we focus and, of course, recognize how the system, as Saida just put it, is built on and based on and dependent on the oppression of Black people, that until we address that, we are all going to experience the consequences of that very system, which was designed to oppress all of us. So I'm not sure where to go sometimes,
If I could be helpful.
Please, let me stop. Yeah.
If I could at all be helpful. I think one, your honesty is where you begin, right? And in the conversation, we're not honest enough to have a real conversation. And I think that's what we're why we're opening today, right? We're opening today. We're not at the end. We're not at the middle. It's the opening panel. I think it's because we have to be honest that we're all trying to struggle with what this system is almost pitting us against each other to do, which is to pony for power. Because that is what racism is, right? Racism is race prejudice plus power. And when we take that equation out, we can get into the oppression Olympics. We can have conversations about, well, it's bad for me too. And sometimes also make the mistake of not wanting to care for our own because we don't want to seem like, we don't want to seem like we're not seeing the next person's oppression too, right? And so we get into this thing where we say, well, maybe it doesn't matter. What we're saying is Black lives have to be something that becomes the forefront of the conversation because the whole thing was designed a particular way. And so it's not to take away from anyone else, because racism has ripped, Tracy and Joe's heard me say this, to take away my humanity is to take away yours, right? And so it has dehumanized everyone. But there is a structural thing that has happened in this dehumanizing situation that puts Black folk at the bottom. There's no questions. Like, this is like, people love data, right? Like, this is the great science, is that the data will tell the story. Well, the story's been told for 400 years. Like, the story's been told. Stop trying to pretend like we don't know the story. The story's been told. Black people are at the bottom. Felicia talked about, equity in finances. As Black CEOs, it's a very different world trying to get money for the same community that another person, our people we've learned to call white, could run an organization serving Black and brown folk and could get triple, if not quadruple what I get. But I look like them, I understand them. And this is a system where we say your lived experience is the best part of your job requirement. Well, hell, who could have a better lived experience than Black folk, right? Talking to other Black folk, yet our white counterparts get more money. These are the scary conversations. And the reason why we can't have the dialogue is because indirectly we are challenging power. And when we challenge power, it becomes very scary. So imagine trying to live your life in a world where your power is supposed to be less than everybody's. And we're talking about whether people are going to use. I'm surprised everybody isn't using in that situation. That's a reality.
I thought about when Saida was talking about power, how when Black CEOs get in white spaces. You get that normative white gaze, you know, like all of a sudden. And I've been in situations where you have a Zoom call, a sea full of white faces, and let one or two black faces get on there, the whole atmosphere changes. And I think that's because they are challenged. We are challenging their power. But I also wanted to say something with Felicia when she was talking about those righteous services that she's running in Harlem and how the people define them. And when you said you weren't necessarily harm reduction, actually, I mean, this holistic embrace that challenges these structures, that's harm reduction. I mean, it's more than just a clean urine, you know, and abstinence. It is looking at, you know, what does Lenox Avenue look like on 118th Street? We have to address that. So I wanted to thank you for that as well. And, you know, in terms of being a Black CEO in a white space of recovery and power and money and the ability, it is, I agree wholeheartedly, intentionally set up for us to always have less than enough. Less than enough. You know, as the CEO of Exponents, the fact that we're looking now at the distribution of dollars, the opioid settlement funds coming in, Tracy can speak to that as well. It's like a mad scramble, but it seems like those that sitting at the table have already sliced off their money, and we're waiting for the crumbs to fall off the table. And that's power in effect. So in 5 years, we'll be scrambling for grants, scrambling to keep our services alive, you know, who to lay off. And so that it is indicative and illustrative of the racism within the behavioral health care system in the state and in this country.
So, you know,
Chaco, I just want to speak and follow up, because that's kind of the thing that we're talking about now is if the potential windfall of dollars to treatment prevention and recovery from the opioid settlement, we buy into the narrative